Comrades, what if I told you that your personal choices are not truly yours? What if the career you pursue, the food you eat, the love you delay, the dreams you abandon, are not guided by free will, but by invisible economic chains? What if the system you defend as neutral and natural has already scripted the boundaries of your life? You are told you are free, free to work, free to buy, free to choose. But what is this freedom when the choice is between exploitation and starvation? What is this liberty when survival demands obedience to forces you do not control? In Capital, I revealed that the laws of capitalism are not mere market tendencies. They are social commandments. They govern your time, your energy, your relationships. The wage is not simply payment, it is a leash. The market is not a space of opportunity. It is an arena of struggle where the owners of capital command and the workers comply. Under capitalism, your life is reorganized around profit. Your mornings are dictated by the factory bell, your evenings by exhaustion, your weekends by recovery for further labor. Even your education is shaped not by the cultivation of human potential, but by the demands of the labor market. You are trained not to think freely, but to function efficiently. In the Communist Manifesto, we declared that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. That struggle does not only take place in parliaments or barricades, it penetrates your most intimate decisions. Why do you postpone having children? Because wages stagnate while rents rise. Why do you accept degrading work? Because unemployment stalks you like a shadow. Why do you move across continents, abandoning your homeland? Because capital migrates and demands that labor follow. The ruling class does not need to command you directly. It designs the conditions in which your choices become predictable. It sets wages low enough that you must compete against your fellow worker. It ensures housing is scarce enough that you must submit to landlords. It floods you with commodities so that you measure your worth not by your humanity, but by your consumption. This is not coincidence. It is structure. In economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, I wrote of alienation, the condition in which the worker becomes estranged from the product of his labor, from the act of production, from his fellow human beings, and from his own species being. Today, alienation is not an abstract concept. It is the silent despair you feel when your labor enriches another. It is the numbness that creeps in when your creative power is reduced to repetitive tasks. It is the loneliness born of competition in place of solidarity. Economic rules quietly shape your personal choices by shaping your possibilities. They determine what is affordable, what is realistic, what is responsible. The system whispers, "Be practical," and practicality becomes submission. It says, "Follow the market," and following the market becomes abandoning your passion. It says, "Think of yourself," and thinking only of yourself fractures the collective strength that could liberate you. Capitalism thrives not merely because of armies or police, but because it colonizes your imagination. It convinces you that there is no alternative, that inequality is inevitable, that poverty is personal failure, that success is individual virtue. But comrades, let us tear away this veil. The economic laws of capitalism are not natural laws like gravity. They are historical constructs, born of private ownership of the means of production. They persist because the bourgeoisie controls industry, finance, land, and the state. They persist because workers remain divided. The worker sells labor power as a commodity. But labor is not a mere commodity, it is life itself. When you sell your labor, you sell hours of your existence. And the capitalist purchases this labor not to sustain you, but to extract surplus value, to expand capital, to accumulate wealth at your expense. This surplus value is the hidden architect of your personal decisions. It explains why productivity rises while wages stagnate. It explains why technology, instead of liberating you from toil, intensifies your exploitation. It explains why crises erupt periodically, throwing millions into unemployment, not because society lacks resources, but because profit falls. You are told to adapt, retrain, hustle, compete. But why must the worker endlessly adjust while the system remains sacred? The truth is this: as long as the means of production are privately owned, your life will orbit around capital's needs. Your creativity will be harnessed for profit. Your relationships will be strained by economic insecurity. Your dreams will be filtered through affordability. And yet, within this very oppression lies the seed of liberation. For capitalism produces its own grave diggers. The more interconnected the global economy becomes, the more the working class expands and unites in shared conditions of exploitation. The same forces that standardize your misery also standardize your power. When you recognize that your personal struggles are collective conditions, isolation dissolves into solidarity. You begin to see that your exhaustion is not individual weakness, but systemic extraction. That your debt is not personal irresponsibility, but structural dependency. That your anxiety is not private failure, but social contradiction. And when this recognition spreads, when workers across factories, offices, farms, and digital platforms understand that their lives are shaped by the same economic logic, then the quiet shaping of personal choices transforms into a loud demand for systemic change. The emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself. Do not merely demand higher wages, demand control. Do not merely seek better conditions, seek transformation. Do not merely adjust your choices, change the system that limits them. Imagine a society where production is organized not for profit, but for human need, where technology reduces labor time instead of intensifying it, where education cultivates critical thought instead of market conformity, where your personal choices are truly personal because they are not coerced by economic desperation. This is not utopian fantasy, it is historical possibility. The economic rules that quietly shape your life today can be rewritten. The structures that confine you can be dismantled, but only through unity, only through collective organization, only through the conscious struggle of the proletariat against the domination of capital. Workers of all lands, recognize yourselves not as isolated individuals navigating a neutral market, but as a class bound by common conditions and common power. Your personal choices have been shaped by economic forces. Now let your collective action shape history. Rise, organize, reclaim your labor, your dignity, your future. Economic structures silently determine the boundaries of your personal freedom. You are taught from childhood that freedom resides in choice: what to study, where to work, what to purchase, whom to love, how to live. Yet every one of these choices unfolds within an invisible architecture constructed by economic power. You do not choose from infinite possibilities. You choose from options filtered through wage levels, property relations, market demands, and social hierarchies. The system presents you with doors and calls it liberty, but it is the system that built the hallway. Under capitalism, The fundamental condition of life for the majority is the necessity to sell labor power in order to survive. This necessity is not a personal decision. It is an economic compulsion. The worker is free in a double sense, free to sell labor to any employer and free from ownership of the means of production. This freedom is celebrated as autonomy, yet it conceals dependence. When survival depends on wages, the range of acceptable choices narrows to those that secure income. Passion becomes secondary to practicality. Curiosity bows before employability. The market whispers what is realistic, and realism becomes obedience to economic constraint. Even education, praised as the pathway to empowerment, is shaped by economic logic. Fields of study rise and fall not according to human enrichment, but according to profitability. Students internalize labor market forecasts, tailoring their aspirations to industries deemed stable or lucrative. Debt further disciplines ambition. When the cost of learning becomes a financial burden, the fear of unemployment intensifies conformity. The promise of self-development becomes entangled with the pressure to generate return on investment, transforming intellectual growth into economic calculation. Housing, one of the most intimate foundations of life, reveals the quiet rule of economic structures. Where you live is rarely a pure expression of preference. It is a negotiation with rent, mortgage rates, and speculative property markets. Communities fracture along lines of affordability. Long commutes steal hours from rest and relationships. The dream of stability bends beneath the weight of rising costs. What appears as personal relocation is often economic displacement. The city reorganizes itself around profit, and your choice of neighborhood becomes a response to price rather than belonging. Relationships themselves are not untouched. Decisions about marriage, children, and care are filtered through income security and job stability. Many delay family life not because affection is absent, but because economic precarity makes commitment risky. Time together is rationed by work schedules. Emotional energy is drained by financial anxiety. The system does not forbid love, it conditions its feasibility. Intimacy becomes scheduled around shifts and budgets. Even leisure is commodified, offered as a product to purchase rather than a space to cultivate freely. Consumption, portrayed as the pinnacle of personal expression, operates within a framework of manufactured desire. Advertising does not merely inform, it shapes identity through commodities. You are invited to construct the self through brands, styles, and technologies. Yet the ability to participate in this symbolic marketplace depends on purchasing power. Status becomes tethered to income. Self-worth is subtly measured by acquisition. The worker produces goods that embody collective labor, yet encounters them as objects to be bought back with wages that represent only a fraction of the value created. Technology, often heralded as liberating, deepens the discipline of economic structures. Productivity tools extend the workday beyond physical workplaces. Gig platforms redefine employment as flexibility while transferring risk onto workers. Algorithms allocate opportunities and monitor performance. What feels like entrepreneurial independence frequently conceals intensified competition and instability. The rhetoric of freedom masks a reorganization of control, where surveillance replaces supervision and ratings substitute for managerial oversight. Crises further expose how fragile personal freedom becomes when economic systems falter. Recessions eliminate jobs overnight, not because individuals lose merit, but because profitability declines. Entire sectors contract, families uproot, savings evaporate. The language of personal responsibility persists even as structural forces dictate outcomes. The individual is told to adapt, retrain, relocate, while the architecture of inequality remains intact. These constraints operate quietly because they are normalized. They are woven into daily life, appearing as common sense. The worker adjusts expectations to align with wages. Dreams shrink to fit budgets. Risk is calculated through fear of loss. Over time, the boundaries of possibility feel natural, even inevitable. The system rarely needs overt coercion. It governs through necessity. Economic dependence disciplines imagination before it disciplines action. To recognize that economic structures shape personal freedom is not to deny agency, but to situate it within material conditions. True freedom cannot exist where survival depends on submission to capital. As long as the means of production remain concentrated in private hands, the majority will navigate lives constrained by profitability. The expansion of authentic freedom requires transforming the very foundations that define possibility, dismantling the structures that reduce human potential to market value, and reclaiming collective power over the conditions that silently contour every choice you believe you make. Wage labor converts and life and creativity into commodities for profit. At the heart of the capitalist order lies a transformation so profound that it reshapes not only economies but the very meaning of human existence. Labor, which is the expression of human vitality, imagination, and collective capacity, is reduced to a commodity to be bought and sold. The worker does not bring finished products to the market as an independent creator. The worker brings labor power, the capacity to work, and offers it in exchange for wages. In this transaction, life itself is measured in hours and priced according to demand. Unlike other commodities, labor power cannot be separated from the living person. When it is sold, what is exchanged is not an external object, but time, energy, skill, and attention, segments of existence that can never be recovered. The wage appears as compensation, yet it conceals a deeper extraction. The capitalist purchases labor power for a fixed period, but during that period, the worker produces value greater than the wage received. This surplus value becomes profit. The difference between what the worker is paid and what the worker creates is the foundation of accumulation. Thus, human creativity becomes a source of private wealth, detached from the one who generated it. In this process, the character of work itself is transformed. Instead of being an expression of self-realization, labor becomes a means to survival. The content of work is determined not by the worker's aspirations, but by the requirements of profitability. Tasks are fragmented, standardized, and optimized for efficiency. Skills are reorganized to maximize output. Creativity is harnessed not to expand human freedom, but to increase competitive advantage. Innovation, which could reduce toil and enrich communal life, is redirected toward reducing costs and intensifying production. The commodification of labor extends beyond the factory floor. In offices, digital platforms, and service industries, personality traits become marketable assets. Friendliness, patience, charisma, and emotional sensitivity are packaged as soft skills. Workers are expected not only to perform tasks, but to perform identities. Emotional labor becomes another dimension of commodified life. The boundary between authentic feeling and professional requirement blurs as expressions of care or enthusiasm are measured by customer satisfaction metrics and performance reviews. Wage labor also disciplines time. The clock becomes an instrument of valuation. Minutes are tracked, shifts are scheduled, productivity is quantified. The rhythm of life bends to the rhythm of production. Sleep, leisure, and social interaction are arranged around working hours. Even rest is framed as necessary for maintaining efficiency. Time ceases to belong to the individual. It is allocated according to contracts and deadlines. The worker learns to internalize this discipline, to feel guilt for idleness, to equate busyness with worth. Under these conditions, creativity is narrowed to what can be monetized. Artistic expression must find a market. Scientific inquiry must secure funding tied to commercial application. Ideas are patented, copyrighted, branded. Knowledge itself becomes property. The collaborative and cumulative nature of human advancement is obscured by ownership claims. What emerges from collective history is enclosed within legal frameworks that convert shared intellect into exclusive rights. This conversion of life into commodity reshapes social relations. Workers compete with one another for employment, promotions, and security. Cooperation is subordinated to competition. Colleagues become rivals in the struggle for limited opportunities. Solidarity weakens as each individual is compelled to enhance personal market value. Education, networking, and self-improvement are pursued less as avenues of growth than as strategies of differentiation. The language of self-investment replaces that of communal development. The wage itself reinforces dependency. Because access to goods and services is mediated by money, survival hinges on continued employment. Loss of work threatens not only income, but housing, healthcare, and dignity. This vulnerability strengthens the power of capital. Workers may endure unsafe conditions, excessive hours, or stagnant pay because alternatives are scarce. The apparent equality of contract between employer and employee masks a structural imbalance rooted in ownership of the means of production. As labor becomes commodity, the worker becomes estranged from the product created. The object leaves the hands of its maker and confronts the maker as property of another. The pride of creation is diluted by repetition and detachment. The product embodies human effort, yet the worker has no claim over its destiny. It enters the market as capital's asset, circulating to generate further profit. Through wage labor, capitalism converts the living force of humanity into an instrument of accumulation. It translates imagination into revenue streams, cooperation into corporate growth, and aspiration into quarterly returns. The richness of human potential is compressed into exchange value, measured by productivity statistics and profit margins. The worker's life becomes divisible into billable hours, marketable competencies, and exploitable talents, each segment evaluated according to its contribution to capital expansion. Each fragment detached from the fuller horizon of collective human flourishing, and redirected towards the relentless reproduction of profit and the perpetuation of economic domination. Alienation isolates workers while capital accumulates power. This is not merely a philosophical abstraction, but a material condition woven into the daily experience of labor under capitalism. Alienation begins at the point of production, where the worker confronts the product of labor as something foreign. What the worker creates does not belong to them. It belongs to capital. The object carries within it the worker's effort, intelligence, and time, yet it stands apart as property of another. The more the worker produces, the more powerful the world of objects becomes, and the poorer the worker feels in relation to it. This estrangement extends beyond the product to the process of labor itself. Work is no longer a self-directed activity through which individuals express their capacities and shape the world according to conscious purpose. Instead, labor becomes an imposed necessity, organized by external authority. The rhythm, method, and goal of work are determined by management, by machinery, by market demand. The worker enters the workplace not as a creative agent, but as a function within a larger mechanism. Activity becomes mechanical repetition, performed not for fulfillment, but for wages. The act of labor, which could affirm humanity, becomes a source of exhaustion and detachment. Alienation also fractures the relationship between workers themselves. Capitalism organizes production through competition. Workers compete for jobs, promotions, recognition, and survival. This competition weakens solidarity and fosters suspicion. Each individual must market skills, protect opportunities, and guard against replacement. Instead of recognizing common interests rooted in shared exploitation, workers are encouraged to see one another as obstacles. Division becomes structural. The unity necessary to challenge capital dissolves into fragmented struggles for individual advancement. The isolation deepens as economic insecurity penetrates power. Evade lifelong hours and precarious employment limit time for community, family, and collective engagement. Social interaction is squeezed between shifts and obligations. Even leisure is shaped by consumption patterns that emphasize individual gratification rather than shared creation. The worker returns home not with a sense of accomplishment, but with fatigue. Emotional energy is drained. Relationships suffer under the pressure of financial anxiety. Isolation becomes normalized, interpreted as personal circumstance rather than systemic design. While workers experience fragmentation, capital consolidates power. Ownership of the means of production grants control over employment, technology, and resources. Profits extracted from collective labor are reinvested to expand production, acquire competitors, and influence political institutions. Economic concentration translates into social and political authority. Corporations shape legislation, media narratives, and public policy. Decisions affecting millions are made by a minority whose interests align with accumulation rather than human well-being. Technology intensifies this dynamic. Innovations that could reduce necessary labor time and expand freedom are deployed to increase efficiency and surveillance. Automation may displace workers, generating unemployment that disciplines those who remain employed. Digital systems monitor performance, quantify productivity, and track behavior. The worker's autonomy shrinks as data becomes a tool of managerial oversight. Capital gains not only economic leverage, but informational dominance. Alienation obscures its own origins. Workers often internalize dissatisfaction as personal failure. If work feels meaningless, they are told to adjust attitude or pursue self-improvement. If wages stagnate, they are urged to acquire new skills. Structural contradictions are reframed as individual shortcomings. This narrative reinforces isolation. Instead of identifying shared conditions, workers blame themselves or compete harder. Capital benefits from this misdirection as systemic critique is diverted into private self-correction. The separation between labor and ownership also distorts the perception of wealth creation. Capital appears productive while labor seems replaceable. Investment is praised as risk-bearing and visionary, while the daily effort of workers is treated as cost. This inversion masks reality. Without labor, machinery remains inert and capital cannot expand. Yet alienation conceals this dependency. Workers see the power of corporations and feel insignificant, unaware that their collective activity sustains the very structures that dominate them. As capital accumulates, inequality widens. Wealth concentrates in fewer hands, enabling further control over markets and governance. Economic crises reveal the fragility of this system, yet responses often reinforce concentration through bailouts and restructuring that protect large institutions while workers bear losses. Alienation persists through cycles of boom and bust, deepening mistrust and fragmentation. The cumulative effect is a society where individuals feel disconnected from their work, from each other, and from political power. The social fabric thins, communities weaken, democratic participation declines as economic forces appear untouchable. Meanwhile, capital strengthens its networks, expands its reach, and integrates global production chains that bind workers across continents without fostering solidarity. Alienation isolates workers precisely as capital requires cohesion. Fragmented individuals are less capable of organized resistance. Divided labor sustains unified capital. The more workers experience themselves as separate and powerless, the more secure the system of accumulation becomes, drawing strength from their separation, reproducing its dominance through their disconnection, and extending its authority across every sphere of life where human cooperation could otherwise flourish as conscious collective power. Individual struggles are collective conditions rooted in class exploitation. What appears to you as a private burden, a personal failure, or an isolated misfortune is in truth a manifestation of a broader social structure that organizes society into opposing classes. The anxiety over unpaid bills, the exhaustion from endless shifts, the fear of unemployment, the humiliation of debt, these are not accidental occurrences scattered randomly across individual lives. They are patterned outcomes of an economic system that depends upon the extraction of surplus value from the many for the enrichment of the few. Capitalism thrives on presenting systemic contradictions as individual dilemmas. When wages fail to keep pace with living costs, the worker is told to budget better, retrain, or hustle harder. When employment becomes precarious, the narrative celebrates flexibility and entrepreneurship. When housing becomes unaffordable, it is described as a matter of supply and demand rather than speculation and profit-driven development. In each case, structural forces are reframed as personal challenges. The worker The worker internalizes responsibility for conditions produced by class relations of the means of production. Those who control land, factories, technology, and capital command the conditions under which labor occurs. Those who lack ownership must sell labor power to survive. This relationship is not merely economic, it shapes social institutions, cultural norms, and political decisions. The insecurity experienced by one worker is mirrored in millions of others because the source lies in a shared position within this structure. The competition you feel against co-workers is not a reflection of natural rivalry, but a consequence of scarcity imposed by profit-driven allocation. Consider debt, which often feels like a solitary weight. Student loans, credit balances, mortgages, each appears as a personal contract. Yet the expansion of credit is a systemic response to stagnant wages and rising costs. Debt compensates for insufficient income, allowing consumption to continue while wages lag behind productivity. What burdens the individual sustains the economy. Financial institutions accumulate profit from interest payments extracted from laborers who struggle to maintain stability. The private obligation is rooted in a collective condition of exploitation. Unemployment offers another illustration. When industries automate or relocate to regions with cheaper labor, displaced workers confront sudden instability. The narrative frames this as unfortunate but inevitable progress. Yet technological advancement could reduce necessary labor for all if organized around social need rather than profit. Instead, automation under capitalism becomes a weapon of discipline, creating a reserve army of labor that pressures wages downward. The fear experienced by one unemployed worker reverberates through entire communities because the mechanism generating it is systemic. Even mental and physical strain reveal collective dimensions. Long hours, repetitive tasks, and precarious schedules generate stress, anxiety, and illness. Workers may interpret these conditions as individual weakness, seeking personal remedies. However, the pattern is widespread because the cause is embedded in the organization of work. When production prioritizes efficiency and cost reduction above well-being, human health becomes secondary. The suffering appears private, yet it is socially produced. Class exploitation also shapes aspirations. Many abandon creative or intellectual pursuits deemed economically risky. Talents are redirected toward stable income rather than personal fulfillment. This redirection is not unique to isolated individuals. It is common across generations shaped by similar pressures. The narrowing of dreams reflects collective constraint. The working class adjusts expectations downward, measuring ambition against financial survival. The fragmentation of experience obscures solidarity. Workers see only their own hardship and may attribute it to poor decisions. The system encourages comparison rather than connection. Success stories are amplified to suggest mobility is universally attainable. Those who struggle are told they simply have not tried hard enough. This ideology divides the exploited, preventing recognition of shared conditions. Yet beneath surface differences of occupation, culture, or geography lies a common dependence on wages and a common vulnerability to market fluctuations. Political structures reinforce this dynamic. Policies that favor capital accumulation, tax advantages for corporations, deregulation, privatization, are justified as promoting growth. The benefits accrue disproportionately to owners, while costs manifest as austerity measures, reduced public services, and weakened labor protections. Individuals feel the impact through diminished healthcare access, underfunded education, and unstable employment. The collective origin of these policies is masked by partisan narratives that redirect frustration toward cultural or personal targets. To understand that individual struggles are collective conditions is to shift perspective from isolation to analysis. The worker's hardship is not an anomaly, but an expected outcome of a system predicated on inequality. Recognition of this reality transforms self-blame into critical awareness. The exhaustion of one nurse, the insecurity of one factory worker, the debt of one graduate, each is a thread in a broader tapestry of exploitation woven through the fabric of capitalist society, binding millions in shared vulnerability, reproducing patterns of deprivation that appear personal yet arise from class relations embedded in the ownership and control of production. Distributing power upward while dispersing hardship across the lives of those whose labor sustains the system, only organized working-class unity can transform economic rules and reclaim true freedom. The economic order that governs society is not a force of nature. It is a human construction sustained by institutions, laws, and power relations. Those who own the means of production do not rule because of superior virtue or intelligence, but because their control over resources grants them authority over the conditions of life. As long They remain subject to its discipline. Unity is not a moral appeal. It is a material necessity born from the structure of exploitation itself. The working class constitutes the vast majority of society. It builds infrastructure, cultivates food, manufactures goods, provides services, develops technology, and sustains daily life. Yet this immense productive force is fragmented into workplaces, industries, and rarely perceive themselves as parts of a collective whole. Capital benefits from this fragmentation by dividing workers along lines of skill, nationality, race, gender, and contract type. The system weakens their bargaining power and obscures their shared interests. Competition replaces solidarity, and division becomes a tool of control. Organization begins with recognition. When workers understand that their conditions are not isolated accidents, but common outcomes of wage lab, or the foundation for unity emerges. Trade unions, cooperatives, and political movements represent early forms of collective resistance. Through coordinated action, strikes, negotiations, demonstrations, workers can challenge immediate injustices such as low wages, unsafe environments, and excessive hours. These struggles reveal a fundamental truth. When labor withholds its effort, production halts. Capital depends entirely upon the cooperation of those it exploits. However, unity must extend beyond isolated demands. Economic rules are embedded in ownership structures and legal frameworks that prioritize profit over human need. To transform these rules requires a broader vision: democratic control over production, equitable distribution of resources, and planning guided by social welfare rather than private accumulation. Such transformation cannot be achieved through individual advancement or isolated reform. It demands organized power capable of confronting entrenched interests. Collective action alters the balance of power because it confronts capital with its own dependency. A single worker can be dismissed. An entire workforce cannot be replaced without cost. A lone voice can be ignored. A mass movement commands attention. Unity transforms vulnerability into leverage. It enables workers to articulate demands not as petitions but as assertions of collective strength. Through organization, the working class ceases to be a passive object of policy and becomes an active subject shaping economic life. True freedom requires more than higher wages within existing hierarchies. It requires participation in decision-making processes that determine production priorities, technological implementation, and resource allocation. Under capitalism, these decisions are concentrated among shareholders and executives whose primary obligation is profit. Organized unity seeks to democratize these spheres, ensuring that those who labor also govern. Freedom becomes substantive when individuals have influence over the conditions that structure their existence. Education and political consciousness are integral to this process. Unity is not spontaneous, it is cultivated through dialogue, shared experience, and critical understanding. Workers must recognize the mechanisms of exploitation and the historical struggles that have expanded rights in the past. Knowledge dismantles the illusion that current arrangements are permanent. History demonstrates that labor movements have secured shorter workdays, safety regulations, and social protections through persistent organization. Solidarity also transcends national boundaries. Capital operates globally, relocating production to maximize profit and undermine local labor standards. If workers remain confined within national divisions, they are pitted against one another in a race to the bottom. International cooperation counters this dynamic by aligning demands across borders. Shared standards and mutual support weaken capital's ability to exploit regional disparities. Obstacles to unity are formidable. Ideological narratives promote individualism, suggesting success or failure rests solely on personal effort. Media outlets often portray collective movements as disruptive or unrealistic. Legal systems may restrict organizing efforts. Yet these barriers underscore the threat that organized labor poses to concentrated power. Resistance from entrenched interests confirms the transformative potential of solidarity. When workers unite, they redefine freedom not as isolated consumer choice, but as collective self-determination. Freedom becomes the capacity to shape workplaces, influence economic priorities, and ensure that technological advancement reduces toil rather than intensifies it. It becomes the assurance that basic needs, housing, healthcare, education, are guaranteed by social cooperation rather than market fluctuation. Organized working-class unity does not seek domination over others, but liberation from structures that subordinate the many to the few. It envisions a society in which production serves communal well-being, where democratic participation replaces hierarchical command, and where economic life reflects shared human aspirations rather than the imperatives of accumulation. Through disciplined solidarity, sustained struggle, and collective imagination, workers possess the capacity to rewrite the rules that confine them, transforming economic power from an instrument of exploitation into a foundation for genuine autonomy, shared prosperity, and conscious control over the social forces that shape everyday existence, comrades. The truth stands before us with unmistakable clarity. What we have been taught to call personal destiny is in reality the quiet administration of economic power. Our labor is commodified, our creativity harnessed, our struggles individualized, our isolation cultivated, while capital accumulates strength from our fragmentation. The system endures not because it is natural or eternal, but because it persuades us to confront it alone. Yet once we recognize that our private burdens are shared conditions, the spell is broken. What seemed like personal weakness reveals itself as structural exploitation. What felt like solitary exhaustion becomes collective experience. And in that recognition, a new force emerges, the power of organized unity. The working class is not powerless, it is divided, it is not incapable, it is misdirected. The same hands that build the world can reshape it. The same minds that sustain production can govern it. When we move from isolation to solidarity, from resignation to organization, from quiet endurance to conscious struggle, we cease to be instruments of capital and become agents of history. True freedom will not be granted by those who profit from our dependence. It will not arise from adapting more efficiently to exploitation. It will be forged through collective action, through democratic control over the conditions of labor, through the transformation of economic rules that confine human potential to the pursuit of profit. Let us no longer accept a world where life is measured by wages and worth by market value. Let us demand a society where production serves humanity, where cooperation replaces competition, where our creative power belongs to us all. The future is not predetermined by economic laws. It is shaped by organized human will. Workers of all lands, recognize your shared condition, unite your strength, and reclaim the freedom that has always been yours to build.